Okay, great. Thank you for the opportunity to spend some time together. And just to set the expectation at the beginning, all of us on the panel are friends. We've all worked together in different ways. And our goal is to try and share information with you, share perspectives with you, and ideally see if we can offer something which is useful to you. So that's going to be a function of whether you want to engage or not. I've got questions and we can end up chatting all day long. It's more important to bring information to you that you would find helpful. So at the risk of having a stony silence when I say, are there any questions, please help me think about things that you might find interesting or relevant, because there's a lot of different experience and a lot of different perspective on the panel. So I'll do the quick self-intro. My name's Steve Leonard. I've set up an entity called SG Innovate. We're a private limited company by structure with one LP, and that's the Ministry of Finance of the Government of Singapore. So we've tried to straddle this private-public parallel universes, act in a commercial way, but have the priorities and associated benefit of being linked with Singapore government. Our goal is to help start and grow deep tech companies. And let me turn over to Darren, and I'm going to ask each person to do their 1-minute self-intro, and then we'll jump in.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Darren Tan from Gowdey Capital. In our group, we've got several things. So Gowdey Equator has got wealth management as a business. We've got consulting, and we've got community. And community in the form of a co-working space, which we're building called Spectrum. And on the fund side, we manage several funds, but we're focused around technology and innovation fund. Currently looking at investing in Series B type companies focused around Southeast Asia.
Okay, David?
I'm David Gowdey. I'm a partner at Jungle Ventures. We're a firm that focuses on Series A, Series B investments in Southeast Asia. About half is consumer, about half is business and enterprise. I've been covering the region for about 20 years from a tech perspective, both at Yahoo and then TBG Capital and now at Jungle.
My name is Lauria, founding partner of Golden Gate Ventures, a VC firm focused on Southeast Asia. We've been in the region since 2011, investing in consumer internet. What's interesting is our thesis hasn't changed since day one. So it's been consumer internet, Southeast Asia. Our check sizes have gone up a little bit, but it's such a hot area, and I see a lot of growth for the next few years.
And my name is Enckell. I do not work for a VC, but I work for something called a startup generator. So we bring in individuals who want to start companies, help them find the right co-founder, validate the idea, and then we invest 100,000 US into the teams with good enough ideas and strong enough teams, and then we help them build over the course of another 3 months. So we're smack in the middle of the very first cohort here in Singapore. So earlier stage, but hopefully we are providing a lot of really cool companies with these guys. So I'm a service provider to the 3 of the other people on the stage here.
Okay, so some great experience and some great different perspectives. And I'm going to jump in. Lisa, when you think about companies from scratch, and you think about individual men and women and their capability in building from scratch, compared to investing in companies that already exist, would you be a fan of building from scratch in all cases, or do you think there's a great place for companies that are seen and are invested in once they already exist? I know you're close to the formation of companies. How does that differ from investing in companies that already exist?
I think I've been doing angel investments on my own for the past 5 years, and it all kind of comes down to the founder much more than the idea. And we see that most of the companies we have invested in have actually changed their ideas quite a few times. But if the founders are strong, it's a good case. So I really believe in that it all boils down to the founders. In particular in this region, and I also think that's true for other regions, we see a lot of really smart people working at big companies, be it Facebook, Google, or more traditional corporates, and they all dream about starting their own startup, but they're waiting for the next promotion, or they're just building out the network, and it's quite not time yet. And what we do, we kind of give them a slight kick in the butt and say, isn't it time now to actually, stop dreaming and start building? And then we help them start great companies. So I do think that there is a lot of talent that's kind of trapped today. And there are so many problems out there, they're just waiting to be solved. So if we can like help getting that talent, address those problems, I fundamentally believe that we will see a lot of great companies coming out of that.
So Darren, at Golden Equator, you've got a diversified range of things. You're an investor in property, you're an investor in different currencies, you're an investor in lots of technology. Is a diversified, multi-interest investor the way that you see being able to add the most value versus a highly specialized, do one thing only type of investor?
Sure, yeah. Well, to clarify, actually in our Golden Equator Group, we have different businesses, but every single business is driven by its own team. It's got its own managing partners, it's got its own CEO. So I can talk a bit about how the different business units kind of lend support. And essentially what we're doing is we're building an extended ecosystem. Let's talk about the wealth management side. We have a team of people who manage wealth for family offices and high net worth. And when you look at family offices in Asia these days, you're starting to see the third and fourth generation coming out, leaving the boring traditional businesses that the families have built, whether it's in shipping, oil and gas, and transportation, and they're excited about tech. And working with them allows us the understanding of how we could look at investments that could eventually correlate to the medium businesses that these families are running. So that's one area of how the cross-sharing and cross-learning actually occurs and allows us to make realistic investment decisions that would impact the family offices. And if we look at how consulting, well, consulting, they're a team of people who are lending digital transformation to companies. And for instance, they're working with the Brunei, Darussalam Enterprise, and they're running boot camps for a place in Brunei. Brunei is a very small country, 400,000 people. But essentially, it's very nascent days, and we can imagine them leapfrogging with technology in very quick time. So running boot camps and helping them understand the tech ecosystem and growing it is important. And this allows us from the capital side as investors to see the very nascent development of tech in a different country, and allows us to invest in the companies and be able to take them into a new marketplace, like for instance Brunei. And lastly, for the community which we're building, that's really important because I think right now what's sustainable in the long term has got to do with the building of ecosystems. Because when we get into the investments of Series A and Series B companies, that is exactly the time when they are running hard with their product and services and rolling it out. I think as venture capitalists, what we can do is really to lend our support in terms of connecting them to the right people, introducing them to the corporations, getting them into new markets, and that's the role where we can add a lot of value and value create. So building that ecosystem comes down to working with several different pillars, and that's what we're focused on in helping build companies.
So, David, you were previously at TPG, and you think a lot about improving the performance of an entity. You're now in venture capital, getting in much, much earlier, Series A, for example. What's the role of the VC, and has it changed, especially in Southeast Asia, in terms of helping build a company in a more active way as compared to investing in a company and getting investor updates? How's the VC co-steering the wheel, or is that too strong a term?
Sure. So, I think one thing to note about this part of the world is that most founders tend to be first-time founders. We don't have, the ecosystem hasn't been developed enough where you start to see second-time founders coming back around and building businesses again. And I think first-time founders, I'd couch it by saying that every company, every group of founders is different. They bring a different level of experience and age, and so they often will need different things. I think to generalize, I think younger founders probably need a little bit more hand-holding in terms of building the business. I think as you think about founders that are a little bit older, I think the average age of our founders in the last cohort was about 36 years old. I think those types of founders, they probably bring with them 10 or 15 years of business experience, probably have some media training, they have some leadership skills, and so what they actually need help with is probably a little bit different than, say, a 26-year-old, which may need a little bit more, involvement by the folks sitting around the board. I think the general thing about this region too is it just comes with a lot of complexity. And even from a consumer and a behavioral perspective, there's a lot of homogeneous elements around the region. Consumers in Indonesia today are not very different fundamentally than consumers in, Thailand or Singapore. How they communicate with friends, how they buy, what they're looking for. There's a lot of homogeneous elements to their behavior. But if you think about actually operating and building a business on the ground, hiring a team, clearing licenses and everything else. I mean, even Gojek today, if you read the paper, is having problems in the Philippines obtaining licenses. There's just comes with a lot of complexity around structure. And so I think once you have done this, over and over and over again with different companies, I think you can bring a lot of that experience to these founders and help them scale out up much faster.
So Vinny, you started with a thesis about Southeast Asia. You're committed to that thesis. You've been growing on that basis. David just talked about some homogeneous characteristics, but also heterogeneous. A lot of these markets are same but different. What's changed? You've been at this now for 5, 6, 7 years in Southeast Asia. Deal complexity, deal size, quality of founders, quality of co-investors. What have you seen?
All of the above. So the ecosystem, I mean, I got attracted to it coming from Silicon Valley where it was very raw and there was not a lot here. And so that was kind of like an attractive challenge to jump into. If I kind of look at it we might have different, we're all investors up here, might have different models of how we kind of approach it. But I look at it as the investor, we're just a vendor plugged into the ecosystem, just like lawyers and corporates. It's the startups, the entrepreneurs that are really driving it. And so how that's changed, I agree there's not yet a second generation of a founder that's built a big company, exited, now building a second company, but there's like a half generation, looking at one right here that's been part of a high growth startup that built a lot of the back end, and then the team, after that company was acquired, left and started their own company. So they might not have founded that first one, but they definitely were part of the ride and helped grow the company. And so that is something that's really amazing. That's probably the biggest change here, that you have these people that now have the experience and have cut their teeth. My view globally is that smart people are evenly distributed around the world, but their access to information and experience, that's what's different. So now, you could go online and watch some videos from top universities, but again, having the experience to build something with some friends, getting some people to use it, that really didn't exist for a while. And when I would meet developers in this region a few years ago and talk to them about, a former computer engineer, just talk to them about their platform, the architecture, I noticed that it was very different than it felt like it was like 15, 20 years old, even though all the information's online. But things just like, working on code in teams and checking in, like just concepts that are religiously understood were very new because they weren't learning in school. So you could read online, but nobody actually built with it. That is changing, and there's definitely best practices coming in, and there's recruitment of talent from all over the globe, from India, from China, from the US, from Europe, that's coming in because they have certain experiences. And what's really exciting is that companies in this region are now big enough that they're attracting talent like that. And I just see it growing faster and faster.
So Lisa, you've been part of some early stage companies, both in Europe and now in Asia. Are there differences, are there sort of glaring differences in terms of the expectations of the venture community in Europe relative to Asia, or do you see it as pretty much the same priorities?
I mean, coming here, I'm from Sweden, but spent quite a few years in San Francisco, came here, spent my first period in this region, in Jakarta, in Indonesia. What was striking to me then was how similar things were. Just like you said, that was 3 years ago, so a bit later than when Vinny came here, but at that point, everyone was using the same language. They were following the same people on Twitter, reading the same blogs. So everyone was using the startup language, if I may say. So I found it shockingly similar. I thought it was I'm going to Indonesia. It felt very special to me, right? And then people come, oh, what do you think about this? Have you reached product market fit yet? Then they started talking the kind of startup language. And I was like, oh, I'm right at home. So there are definitely big similarities. I think in terms of what you expect from investors, I think people now are more kind of educated, it's more sophisticated here as well. But that's just looking at Europe 10 years ago and what Europe looks like today. It's just, the startup ecosystem is younger here, and it's a little bit older in Europe, and it's way older in Silicon Valley. So everything will come, I think. And most of it kind of comes from being, like you said, if you have been part of one journey before, be it an early employee, then you come on and you do it again, but on your own, then you know what mistakes to avoid and what to look for. So that's really happening now, where we see those kind of second time, or the early employees getting in there. And I just wish that more employees should ask for equity in this part of the world earlier as well, so they also have some capital when they start their next company.
I'm going to keep going on things that I'd like to talk about. Are there any things that anybody in the audience would like to talk about? So I'm going to take a second and see if anyone wants to shout out a question. Yes, please. Oh, okay.
Thank you. You talked a lot about the founders growing or coming a second time around and the maturity of the ecosystem. Can you talk about the investors and how they're growing, and how many investors have a second or third generation fund by now that is successful? Thank you.
Yeah, so I can say, like, I've grown a lot. I didn't know anything about investing. So I had built 2 companies before. My investing for the first time was ever out here. I've now launched 3 funds. So yeah, just like the entrepreneurs here, I'm learning in an atmosphere that things are happening very fast. Like, would I have the ability to have learned all this if I was in the Valley over the past 7 years? No, because this is a very different, size of fish tank and competitiveness. So for some of the people, definitely people on stage, a lot of the entrepreneurs that are in this ecosystem, the competition levels aren't there yet, and the ability to kind of like learn as you're going and make mistakes along the line definitely play out. And this is how little I knew. So I'd raised money twice from VCs for startups. So when I thought about launching a fund, I literally went to VCs on Sand Hill Road in Silicon Valley because that's all I knew. And I probably heard 30 to 35 no's within 2 weeks. And that's when it dawned on me, okay, so VCs don't invest in VCs. Many told me that. Where else do I need to go to? And the terms like family office, I'd never even heard that. But like now I understand this world a lot better. I don't have that financial background, but yeah, so I can say for myself, I've learned so much. I look back every year, I'm like, I can't believe how much I didn't know last year. So I expect 1 year from now, I'm also going to learn a lot. But it's been an amazing ride.
I think I'll just add a point. I think right now the way investors think, especially in our region, it's got to do with the environment of the entrepreneurs that we're seeing. And I think there's quite a big difference if you compare in North America, is how the entrepreneurs think and how entrepreneurs, for instance, in Singapore think. Because I think back in 2012, 2013, that's where the government wanted to really accelerate and jumpstart the whole tech ecosystem. And as a result, there was a lot of funding available. It was what you call relatively easy money. So for me, I see that as quite a big differentiator, because someone who gets into a program and decides to be an entrepreneur as opposed to get into corporation, in America, you probably do it primarily because you believe you want to solve an issue. There's a pain point you want to address. And the passion and drive could be different from someone who's here, who is doing it primarily because it thinks that, you know what, let's try this because I can get the funding, I can take it to a certain level, and let's see what happens. So the mentality and the drive could differ right at the very start. And so government support, it's a double-edged sword. It's a combination of good and bad, but getting on to solving problems and getting that initial funding and why the founder and the CEOs and the teams are solving that problem is something which we have to continuously question. Over time, they might pivot to the point where do you find success? But this is where I think there's a big difference in how entrepreneurs start off in Asia and in North America.
So and David, I'll come to you in just a second on that, but just to pick up on that from an editorial perspective, we were all, and I'm saying we in the sense that I've worked for Singapore government since 13, and there was a big, and continues to be, an ongoing discussion, water a plant too little, water a plant too much, what's the perfect amount? And so this idea of scarcity of funds forces certain behaviors, and a surplus of funds encourages certain behaviors, and both of those have things to try and confront. But Singapore has no lack of talent, and it has no lack of capital, and it has no lack of corporates. So the question then is, what does it take to really break through? David, you've been a part of raising multiple funds. Jungle went from something now to a multi-fund family. Do you want to talk about that journey?
Sure. So we're also on our third fund. Originally founded same time as Golden Gate. If I think back 5 years ago, that was a very nascent ecosystem. I was at TBG Capital. We were even within our growth fund where we were doing 20 to 50 million equity checks. There just wasn't a lot of companies coming through the funnel. And I think there are lots of contributing factors to that. And I think if flash forward to today and you see a lot of the macro tailwinds have driven a lot of the businesses. We have a very young population that are connected through smartphone devices. There's an increasing rate of urbanization, so they're moving into areas where logistics and payments and everything gets much, much easier. And there's a high GDP growth, which leads to high GDP per capita, particularly in urban areas. And so you're just seeing a lot of consumption, a lot of middle-class consumption, and all of that is now flowing through digital channels. And so the ability to actually build a business in this part of the world, I think, is much, much different today than it was, even 3 to 5 years ago, which is creating really compelling opportunities for founders. And then the complexity of the region also leads to very unique problem sets. And so, why do businesses become really big, either on the consumer or enterprise side? It's because they're solving really big problems for the market that they're addressing. And in this part of the world, you have a very large total addressable market size within most categories. We have really strong pain points. And so I just think you're going to see more and more interesting businesses. And the gestation cycle from being a startup at this stage all the way through to being a unicorn, I think, is going to compress, just like it has in every other market around the world.
Just one thing to add there. I've been seeing for the past only couple of years is also the interest from international investors, be it like Sequoia coming from India, all the Chinese investors coming into both Indonesia and also here in Singapore, and the big presence from really, also of course the Japanese with SoftBank, the Rakuten and everything. So there is a big, I would say, international interest that we didn't necessarily see a couple of years ago. So that also kind of says something about the growth and what's been happening in this region for the past couple of years.
And yeah, to touch on that, because I've had the fortune of seeing startup ecosystems on almost every continent around the globe, that there is something very unique about Southeast Asia. So especially for the folks that have traveled in, you guys have been on partly on a global conference. There's some unique things about this region. So there's challenges, but those create opportunities. The growth rate, the earning power is just double-digit growth year over year. The governments do act all differently within each country. I do think Singapore does a very good job of not overwatering the plant. And I do think what it has done here in Singapore in terms of financing and support has 100% spilled over into the success of the region. And other things that exist are competition here that you don't see in other parts of the world. So I've talked to friends that run VCs in Latin America and Mexico, and I asked about like mobile adoption and mobile rates. And then one thing I remember on a phone call asking, wait, how many telcos do you guys have in the country? And in countries like Mexico, it's one, and in other Latin American countries, it's just one, and they're government owned. And so that means there's not a lot of competition, the price of data is high, and people just don't get as addicted to it. Yet here in this market, across the region, every market has a handful of telcos. So it's very competitive, and you see that not just data consumption, but foreign companies coming in, local companies coming in. There's a lot of competition happening in this region, and to me, that drives a lot of innovation.
And I think just to pick up on the point, Singapore plays an important role in ASEAN for those that are visiting from outside. So this year, Singapore is chairing ASEAN, but the important point isn't just that chairmanship, it's the ongoing leadership. So the minister to whom I reported for a couple of years would host an event annually with the technology and telecoms ministers from across Southeast Asia to talk about things that Singapore had done well, had been concerned about, had not done as well as it wanted. So there is a lot of influence, and so we never look at Singapore as the market. We always look at Singapore as a place from which, just like our friends in Israel don't look at Israel as the market, and nobody that I know in San Francisco builds for Northern California. So we don't want to be defined by or limited to how we think of Singapore. For those that think it's not a big market, we would agree, but it's a great place to build from. Other questions that people would like to ask our panelists? I think somebody in the back waving. I'm sorry, it's hard to tell with the light. Sorry, we'll come back over there. There was one by the wire card sign as well. Yes, please.
Hi, thanks very much for the interesting panel. My name is Jochen. I run the International Monetary Fund's office here in Singapore. One complaint I hear a lot from big businesses in the region is that it's really 10 separate markets, and you have all these regulatory restrictions despite all this talk about the ASEAN Common Economic Community, etc. From your angle in e-commerce, in startups, what are the main pain points on the regulatory side that would make it much easier for businesses to operate across ASEAN? And how would that help businesses really to compete perhaps with, especially the Chinese who have this big market to fall back on? Thanks.
Go for it, anybody?
Yeah, it's an interesting topic. You know, it's because the ASEAN has a lot of ASEAN-based regulations, which I think, if you think about import-export, that allow free goods to flow between markets, but actually the pain point comes at customs. And so it's not that you can't regulate that, you know, tariffs and treaties can be signed for trade between countries, but it's actually the implementation of that at a local level is where a lot of the complexity actually comes. And I think you have to think about your question from different frameworks. If it's a purely consumer-based product, then there's really no need to have local operations in every single market. As long as you can adjust for language, I think you can launch a lot of consumer-based products around the region without a lot of friction from a geographic perspective. If you wanted to go into payments, or if you wanted to go into consumer credit, or if you wanted to go into some vertical categories where there is a little bit higher of a regulatory regime within most markets, then I think you're going to run into very domestic issues. And as you try and move from one market to another, then I think you're going to face a lot of those complexities, and each one will have to be thought of in a very phased and structured way. And so I think in some categories you see less regionalization, and they tend to be in those more regulated vertical categories. But I think the thing to take into mind too is that most of these countries, Indonesia was one of the first countries in the world to have a P2P license regime, for example. The MAS in Singapore has been, very progressive in terms of how they're building sandboxes and trying to facilitate the development of tech companies. Thailand is very focused on developing a startup ecosystem. And so it's one category where you're going to see a lot of government support in trying to assist companies and build themselves. And I think most countries recognize that in order to really gain scale, you have to become more of a regional player. There's some markets like Indonesia where I think you could argue that you could become enough of a large player just within that domestic market. But I think most companies will tend to think about, how can I scale across multiple markets? And so I think ultimately with time, you'll see more and more countries coming behind this and looking for ways to where they can facilitate the ease to expand.
And regulation is only one of the issues, right? I think at least for a lot of consumer companies, you mentioned e-commerce, logistics is very different as well. So if you just cross the border between Indonesia and then Philippines, Vietnam, you have very different kind of logistics challenges that you need to deal with that are not easy. So there's not a lack of challenges in order to kind of scale within the region, but still it's such a big region and it's such a big opportunity. But I would say being like in Sweden and scaling a company across Europe is pretty easy compared to being here and scaling across this region.
But it creates business opportunity. So on the startup side, all of it's exciting, and we've, anything payment related, lending related, heavily regulated. But we've invested in companies that are attacking that in multiple markets, and so if they can get that and they start going regional, it creates a bit of a moat. On the flip side, what I would say is, all right, you might have ease of doing business across the EU, but then, for some corporates, Facebook, Google, privacy laws, that becomes a little bit more challenging them. And so where I see them fighting certain fights in individual countries in this region, my guess is then they'd also be complaining if it was like unified and it was a much larger voice. So I think there's probably some give and take and advantages they're getting from it and disadvantages.
GDPR has been a very significant scenario for a lot of companies trying to understand from this side, do they interact with and with whom do they try and manage this data privacy challenge now that GDPR is in effect. There was a question at the back, somebody else, or want to make sure that I didn't miss you if you were still interested.
Hi there, Steve. Michael Blakey from Cocoon Capital. A lot of money now is very focused on Series A and based out of like Singapore and Indonesia. But I know Golden Gate and Enckell started off at more seed level where the focus is more of a local, and when you go to Series A, you kind of look more at a regional level. What do the panelists think of what's going on in the early stage investment outside of Singapore and Indonesia in countries like the Philippines, Vietnam? And is there a concern there's not enough support at the very early stage, which is going to become feeders for what you're looking to invest in at the Series A level?
Since called out, I'll jump in. Since day one, we've been investing across the region. My view is always you need to go regional. Even our Indonesian companies, which is a huge market, we're trying to look about how would they go regional. And you see in the biggest companies, Gojek has investors pushing them to go to other countries. So that has always been part of it. Now, in terms of funding in the ecosystem, I guess I look at everything over a third dimension, which is across time. And for me, like, things are all kind of fitting in place. So 4 years ago, you would have said there was no Series A funding in Singapore or Indonesia. That's definitely not the case. Now you might say there's very little Series B dedicated funds, but that will change as well. So I look at it as the whole region's changing. And so some markets have, grown faster, and other markets are growing, but just not there yet. So is there enough seed capital? Yeah, I mean, in Vietnam, in Thailand, in the Philippines, you have telcos that have spun out with either seed funds or accelerators, banks. 500 startups has opened up 500 startups in a handful of these countries. Angel investors are now looking at other markets that are happening and saying, hey, I kind of want to do this. So I see it over time. On a very, very good path. But yeah, if you were to take the cross-section right now, you could say there is a huge gap, but I see that gap being filled.
I think the thing that I'll add to that too is that great companies I think will always find funding, no matter which market you're in. And could you always have more seed funding? I think every market in the world would say, even if you go to Silicon Valley today, I would say there's actually there's a lot of data, if you go look online, that seed funding has actually decreased in the Valley. So I think every market would say, well, we could use more at seed, but then also, that also means that there's more, less interesting companies getting funded at a seed level. I think the most interesting companies will always find capital to back them. I think our challenge is identifying those as early as we can into the cycle and making sure we can bring as much value and capital to them as they grow.
I think to add to that, I think so the question also flips to the other side, whether there's enough funding for the Series B or Series C side. I think in the past 5 years, the ecosystem in Southeast Asia has really developed. And I think right now at every stage, there is funding available. And completely agree with David's point that I think if we dive into details, sometimes the devil's in the details, we actually see some companies not getting funding, and it's primarily because it's about the wrong timing or the wrong market fit. But if it's right, good companies will always attract the funding, and capital will chase it.
And
So-
about the later stage, Series B and above, that's an international market in my opinion. So at that point, you are somewhat of an international player. You should be of interest for international players as well. So I don't think that gap is very regional. And in terms of talent, if we start even before the companies, we do have a lot of founders coming in from Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, and there is great talent pools there that are super willing to come here to Singapore because they believe this is a great platform for them to be in, to really build a truly kind of regional company here with the potential of going global. So there is definitely a lot of great talent who also come here and build companies.
And if I could add, if you see any awesome companies that you think are not getting invested, please email vinny@goldengate.vc. I would be more than happy to look at them. And if we don't invest, I'd be more than happy to have a conversation on kind of why not.
All right, we're going to have to pick up the pace. We've got a couple of questions, so I don't know who came in which order. So here's what I'm going to ask, because I want to try and see if we can rapid fire. So do me a favor, frame it quickly, ask your question, and then one person will answer on behalf of the panel, and we'll go to the next one. Go.
Okay, hi, I'm Barbara from Pact. I'm a founder. How soon, and it's about a digital wardrobe, and we're turning it into a smart wardrobe. So very interested in the whole smart cities integrating into buildings context. How soon do you think we should be looking at regional expansion? We're now in Hong Kong and Tokyo. Is it important for you as an investor to see us in multiple cities?
Go.
Well, I think my advice is don't think about what investors think. Think about your business model and the right time and right market fit for you to expand and for you to, and the rationale and the reason for that expansion. So don't always think of what will get you the milestones to get the capital, but focus on your business, focus on your proposition, or whether there's relevance. Because if we give you a time, if we give you specific areas, that becomes like a checklist, and it's not as real as it gets.
So there's always a balance between the founder's commitment and the investor's perspective. Neither one should overwhelm the other. Next.
I'll be
Anybody have a
quick.
question?
I'll be quick. How often do you walk away from deals because of valuation? And how do you get to like the middle ground with founders who start at a very sort of all the way to the right side of valuation?
I'll start, and then you can go.
No. One of you, go.
One, you know, at the stage that we invest in, you know, it's if I think about later stage, you can look at comps, you can look at valuation multiples, and you can have a financially based conversation with a founder that's based on their comp set. I think at the stage that we're investing at, it tends to be sitting down in a negotiation around, mainly it's around dilution, which backs itself into valuation.
I was trying to go back to the audience, but Vinny, based on your violent head shaking.
I don't think it's that easy. So it is, for me, it's emotional. There's ego. There's a lot of things in it. It is, all right, what does your next round have to look like? And let's work that backwards. And can this make sense? At the end of the day, it's getting hot. It's getting competitive. There's multiple term sheets. And so we've walked away from at least 2 deals, but valuations are going up.
Before I go back out, can I ask anybody that wants to, we see this a bunch, that the idea that a big valuation is a big badge of honor, but it doesn't leave room for the next and the next round. Does anybody want to talk about the fact that the biggest valuation isn't necessarily the best thing for the founder?
Well, that's pretty clear. It sucks to do a down round later on, right? It's and I think a lot of people might not realize that. But there are 2 sides of it. It's like if there is money available, you always need more money than you think. On the other hand, there is definitely a challenge of just because there's a bit of hype now and you could get that valuation, then where does that company and what milestones do you have to achieve in order to do that?
Less and less room for the follow-ons. Yes, another one, please.
Hi, JJ from Carousel. Question about the rise of the super apps in this part of the world. You know, the Gojeks, Grabs. Big money behind them, going to every vertical. How do you guys see this changing the VC landscape, and does this put a cap on, you know, the amount of entrepreneurship startups you see in this part of the world?
I'll answer from someone who's not on your board. You know, if you think about why is the US and China such an interesting tech ecosystem, one of the big parts of that, in addition to having very strong public equity markets, is a very strong M&A market. And so if you think about in the US, you had Google, you had Facebook, you had large internet tech players that were very active from an M&A perspective, either diversifying, acquiring talent, you know, moving into adjacencies. China, same thing. I think if you contrast that to India, that never quite developed in India. You had Flipkart, you had Paytm, you have large tech businesses that just weren't very active. And so my hope is that in Southeast Asia, Gojek, Grab, Carousel will become large tech platforms that will be buyers in the market as they think about moving more horizontal or moving into adjacencies. And that then feeds the venture ecosystem, which then creates more founders, which then self-propagates itself. So my hope is that they all become much, much more active from an end.
We need some mafias, right? The famous expression about the PayPal mafia, where everybody went out and became amazing founders in their own right, founders or investors. Next.
This is Zachary from EDB Investments. I have a question on exits. You spoke about M&A as the main form of exits, especially from these conglomerates from Korea, Chinese, and Japanese. Just wanted to understand if IPO would be a kind of a trend for Southeast Asian companies moving forward.
IPO, viable or not viable?
I think it depends on who your business is and which exchange is going to be most relevant. You know, I think Hong Kong for certain businesses could be quite interesting. I think the ASX for certain businesses, certainly iProperty, iCar Asia. There's been, you know, a track record of Southeast Asian businesses listing on the ASX. NASDAQ, you know, obviously you have to get to quite a sizable scale in order to become attractive, but SEA, I think, has shown that they can generate pretty good liquidity and, you know, strong returns, so.
And that said, I think most VCs that look at Southeast Asia, we are seeing trade sales as the most interesting option.
Yes, next. Because I'm out of time, I want to make sure. Yes, please. Can you just shout? Yeah. Oh, okay, as a board. Yeah. I don't
know what that means. Like in Singapore, as a
yeah, I think it's...
Oh, the Singapore Stock Exchange. My view is this. It's going to be a chicken or the egg in retail investors, and the amount... You can raise more money in the private markets in this region as a tech company than the Catalyst. My view of how to grow this is encourage existing companies, not in tech, that are public, to buy public companies. That'll train the market, that'll make it exciting, people can see some good positive headlines from it.
I think our goal is to find some wins. So I think as long as we can have exits where there's wealth creation and there's multiples and people can make money. So from our perspective, and I'm saying quasi-linked to government, exits and people unlocking money and having a chance to recycle is a good thing. This idea of driving to an IPO as an inevitable, important outcome isn't the key, but we're not seeing enough liquidity events, to use the expression. That's why equity, for people that are interested in forming companies, we don't have enough discussion about ESOPs and so on because there hasn't been enough wealth creation for people to be believers. We're out of time, so I just wanted to see if anybody on behalf of the panel would like to bring home this point about the changing landscape of the VC in Southeast Asia. Anybody have a pithy, exciting 30-second wrap-up?
The one thing that, compared to Silicon Valley, when you're a VC, you sit in your office, Sand Hill Road, everyone comes to you. As a startup, you try to go around lunchtime so you get a free lunch. In this region, all of us are spending time in different countries on the ground. So it's very, very different. So the changing landscape in this region it's about getting out of the building and being on the ground.
And I think the great thing is that while we have a lot of friends in San Francisco and elsewhere, they suffer from a perspective that all great things happen within a certain radius of Menlo Park and Sand Hill Road. And the important thing is there's huge opportunities for the future occurring in Southeast Asia and in non-North American markets. And we think that we continue to grow and creep up on everybody while they're focused on themselves. So there will be some very exciting headline things happening right here, and we're glad that you're a part of it. So thank you very much, everybody.